Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be with you on a Thursday night. Wow, Shabbos is almost here. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Thursday night? James in Indianapolis, Yehud in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, John in Maine, Paul in Chicago, Nancy in North Carolina, Steve in New Hampshire, Rick in Chicagoland, Dawn says Shema. Well, we say Shema in the morning and in the evening. Welcome, Dawn. Sean says, boom, let's go. I love it. Charles Shapiro with a thumbs up. Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Renee in Indiana, Paul in the Great Northwest, Timothy in Central Arizona. Paula says, Shalom, Miriam in Hayden, Colorado. John checking in from Scotland in the middle of the night. Welcome, John. Gwen in Michigan. Patrice in Utah. Shandora in the Bronx. Elvis says, I desperately need this Talmud time tonight, Sal. Shalom from Geneva, New York. May our class tonight be soothing and uplifting for you. And over there on the YouTube side, Yitzhak in Kansas City, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. All right, we've been doing a lot of work with body parts and body functions. Tonight, we're back to, more, I would say, standard Talmudic reasoning. I actually found this page soothing. It's not too difficult, but it takes some concentration to follow the logic. Where are we holding? This is page 73. We're in chapter 8 of Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. Generally, these are the laws of levirate marriage, yibum. But here in chapter 8, we got started with what a priest can and cannot eat according to his condition, which was related in chapter 7 to who can marry and who cannot marry a priest and what ramifications when prohibited marriages occur. But now we're sort of wandering a bit afield from the laws of levirate marriage. And now that we got into priests and whether an uncircumcised priest can serve in the temple, yes, if the lack of circumcision is for a medical reason, but no, he may not eat teruma. He may not eat food that is consecrated for priests. Only can eat it. Teruma can only be eaten by priests. It's the very first tithe when the temple is standing that farmers in Israel would put aside for the priests, but only a circumcised priest may eat of it. And we derive these laws somewhat from the laws of who may eat the Korban Pesach. And tonight we're going to be tying these laws to the Bikurim, the first fruits, and the Meiser Sheni, the second tithe. So just to quickly review what that concept is, Bikurim, right? These are the first fruits that come in, and they must be brought to Jerusalem. And when a person brings their first fruits to Jerusalem, and it's a gift for the priests, they make a declaration in Jerusalem that they brought these fruits here. It's in gratitude to all the blessings that God has showered on us, that he made us a distinct people, that he rescued us from slavery in Egypt, that he brought us to the promised land, and that he gave us, fertility in our land, and I was able to bring these fruits. And I did not eat them in a state, the priesthood said, the man says, I did not bring them in a state of impurity, and I did not eat impure things, etc. That's part of it. We'll get to it. And Meiser Sheni, that's second tithe. So a farmer who's producing in the land when the temple is standing, the very first 2%, that's going to go to the priests as teruma. The next 10% is going to go to the Levites who did not receive a portion of land like the other tribes. And then the second tithe, it depends on which year we are in the Shemitah cycle, the 7-year cycle of productivity in the land, where in that second tithe, right, in the first and second year and in the fourth and fifth year, is used for a person to have what to eat when they go up to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot. And in the third and sixth years, they don't use it for themselves. It gets given to the poor, right? It's amassed as a stockpile of charity for the poor. All right, those are general concepts that we're going to need today. We picked this up on 73a. And we're returning to a previous discussion. So they raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshis. In the case of an uncircumcised man, what is the law? So this is a Jew who is uncircumcised. What is the law with regard to his eating second tithe, right? So he eats second tithe. Now he has a choice. He can either take that food with him from his farm, carry it to Jerusalem during the pilgrimage festivals, so he'll have what to eat in Jerusalem, or if he's got a really long walk and it's going to be, a lot of a load to carry all the way to Jerusalem, he can exchange it for money, but then that money is consecrated. Just like second tithe, Meiser Sheni is consecrated food. It's for himself to eat, but it can only be eaten in Jerusalem during a pilgrimage festival. But he could also exchange it for money, and then the money that he received when he sold that second tithe, at which point that food is deconsecrated. Whoever bought it can eat it, doesn't have to take it to Jerusalem. But the money that he receives, the Torah actually says he binds it up in his hand, meaning it's set aside from his other money. He can only use that money to go up to Jerusalem during the pilgrimage festival and eat and drink and be merry during those festivals in Jerusalem. So now the question is being asked, okay, he's ascending to Jerusalem. He's got his second tithe, either produce or money. What if he is a Jewish man who is not circumcised? Now that could happen out of medical necessity, or because, there was medical necessity when he was young, and so he couldn't be circumcised, but later, when there was no danger to get circumcised, he chose not to, right? So at that point, he would be choosing to violate the commandment that Jewish men be circumcised, and he would be considered an apostate. So if he's an apostate, if he's a heretic, can he eat second tithe? I mean, you wouldn't think that if he wants to be an apostate Jew that he was going to go up to Jerusalem for the festival and eat his second tithe. But nevertheless, the question is asked. So they raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshis. In the case of an uncircumcised man, what is the law with regard to his eating second tithe? Can one claim that just as the law governing the Paschal lamb, right, the Korban Pesach, the Passover lamb that we eat only at Passover, slaughter it on the 14th of Nisan, eat it that night when Passover begins on the 15th of Nisan. We only eat Passover lamb when the temple is standing, and we can sacrifice it, slaughter it in the temple, and then bring it out for that group of people to eat. An uncircumcised Jew may not partake of the Korban Pesach. So do we apply that law just as an uncircumcised Jewish man cannot partake of the Passover lamb, so too he cannot partake of the second tithe? Can one claim that just as the law governing the Paschal lamb is derived from the law governing the second tithe with regard to acute mourning, another law being brought into our discussion? Acute mourning, meaning somebody who lost a close relative that very day, right? That very day, before the deceased is buried. So when you are a mourner for 7 days, you're sitting shiva. after the deceased is buried. But before the deceased is even buried, you are an acute mourner. And then there's a whole bunch of laws that apply to you during that state. Okay, so can one claim, just as the law governing the Paschal lamb is derived from the law governing second tithe with respect to acute mourning, in that an acute mourner who may not eat second tithe is likewise prohibited from partaking of the Paschal lamb, so too the law concerning second tithe is derived from the law concerning the Paschal lamb with regard to the lack of circumcision, right? So just as we compare these two laws, who can eat the Passover lamb, who can eat second tithe, if you're an acute mourner, you cannot eat either. Therefore, should we also extend in both directions this idea of the uncircumcised? The uncircumcised Jewish man cannot partake of the Passover lamb. Maybe therefore, since we've extended stringencies from the Korban Pesach to the second tithe with regard to the acute mourner, so too we should extend the stringency from the Korban Pesach to the second tithe with regard to the uncircumcised man. That's the question. Or perhaps the law governing the stringent case of the Paschal lamb is derived from the law governing the lenient case of second tithe. But the law concerning the lenient case of second tithe is not derived from the law concerning the stringent case of the Paschal lamb. And therefore it is prohibited for an uncircumcised man to partake of the Paschal lamb, though he may eat second tithe. So Rav Sheshes said to them, that was a complicated question, here comes the answer. Rav Sheshes said to them, you already learned the answer to this question in a Mishna, in Mishna Chala 1:9. So the following laws apply to both teruma, right, food consecrated, only priests can eat it, and bikurim, first fruits of the new harvest. Every year you have first fruits. These are going to be brought to Jerusalem also, which must be given to the priests. If a priest ate of them while in a state of ritual impurity, he is liable to the punishment of charis, death at the hand of heaven. And if a non-priest ate them unintentionally, he must restore the value of the produce he ate and add 1/5 of its value as a fine. And they are both forbidden to non-priests, right? Only priests can eat teruma. Only priests can eat the bikurim, the first fruits that are brought to Jerusalem by these farmers. So the Mishnah continues, and they are considered in all regards the private property of the priest to whom they were given, right? Teruma must be given to priests generally, but you actually have the benefit of the specific gift, right? A person must give teruma, that first 2% of his produce, to a priest, but he gets to choose which priest. If he has a friend who's a Cohen, he can give it to the friend. Once he gives it to that friend, the priest, that priest owns that teruma, and likewise with bikurim, the first fruits. So they are considered in all regards the private property of the priest to whom they were given, and they are nullified. So these are other laws about bikurim and teruma. They are nullified, i.e. rendered permitted for consumption by non-priests in a mixture of 100 to 1. If a little bit of teruma fell into a whole lot of chulin, right, regular produce that is not consecrated, if it's a ratio of less than 100 to 1, then that whole bunch of produce is now rendered prohibited, and no one can eat it. Or I guess a priest could eat it, but it was like there was only a little bit of teruma, which only a priest could eat. It fell into a lot of regular produce for other people to eat. That teruma is going to render it prohibited for all the regular people unless the non-consecrated produce is in a ratio of 100 to 1 or more vis-a-vis the teruma. That's called nullification. When there are at least 100 parts of permitted food for each part of teruma, and this also applies to the bikurim, the first fruits. And another comparison of bikurim and teruma is that they both require washing of the hands before they may be eaten by the priest. And if a priest is ritually impure, if he is tameh, perhaps he touched a human corpse, or he touched a dead creeping thing, or he came into contact with a mitzora, somebody who has the skin condition tsaraz, any of these things would render the priest impure, and in the impure state, he may not eat teruma or bikurim. He has to go through a purification process. If it's a simple impurity, a simple teruma, so he immerses in the mikvah, he waits for nightfall, and then he can eat the teruma or the bikurim. And all of these laws apply to teruma and bikurim, which is not the case with Meiser Sheni, second tithe. So Rav Sheshes resumes his argument, and if it is so that one who is uncircumcised may eat second tithe, well, then let the Tana of that Mishnah that we just read teach it is prohibited for an uncircumcised man to eat of teruma and first fruits, which is not the case with regard to second tithe. Just as he taught all those other stringencies which apply to teruma and bikurim, and then he said, but it's not the case with second tithe. And we know that an uncircumcised priest may not eat teruma, and I think probably not eat bikurim. But if he also cannot eat second tithe, then it would have said so. Since it listed all those stringencies, Rav Sheshes' argument is, if it was also true that an uncircumcised man cannot or can eat second tithe, as opposed to eating teruma and bikurim, it would have been listed in that Mishnah. The Gemara rejects this argument. And if it is so that one who is uncircumcised may eat second tithe, that in that sense it is unlike teruma and bikurim. That's Rav Sheshes' argument. The Gemara rejects this argument. This is no proof, as the Tana of our Mishnah taught only some of the differences between teruma and first fruits on the one hand and second tithe, Meiser Sheni, on the other. But maybe he omitted stringencies. There's no guarantee that this was an exhaustive list of everything that teruma and bikurim have in common on the one hand and is different from Meiser Sheni. He listed several stringencies that have that quality. They apply to teruma and first fruits and don't apply to Meiser Sheni. But it doesn't mean that that was an exhaustive list of the stringencies that share that attribute. And the Gemara asks, the Mishnah is sometimes not exhaustive, but it never omits only one case. If it's going to list a series of attributes that apply to, certain things and not to others, and there's 6 of them, well, it wouldn't have listed 5 and left out the 6th. If there was, 6, it might have listed only 4 and said it's not an exhaustive list. But if there were 6, it would never have mentioned 5 and omitted the 6th. So what other... The Gemara asks, the Mishnah is sometimes not exhaustive, but it never omits only one case. So what other difference did he omit that you say that he also omitted this difference? And the Gemara answers, there are other attributes. It's not that he omitted only one. He omitted the following. As he teaches in the latter clause of the Mishnah, there are laws that apply to second tithe and first fruits, which is not the case with regard to teruma, as the second tithe and first fruits require that they be brought to a particular place, Jerusalem, but that doesn't apply to teruma. Teruma, we set it aside for priests to eat, but they don't have to eat it in Jerusalem. You're a farmer way up in the north of Israel, near Haifa, let's say, or whatever it was called 2,000 years ago, and you set aside 2% of your produce, and you give it to your neighbor who's a Cohen. He can eat it right then and there. He doesn't have to eat it in Jerusalem, and you don't have to bring it to Jerusalem. Whereas Meiser Sheni and first fruits need to go to Jerusalem. And another attribute that first fruits and Meiser Sheni share, which is not the case with teruma, is that they both require a declaration. As a declaration must be made on the last day of Passover in the 4th and 7th years of the Shemitah cycle, the sabbatical cycle, the 7-year cycle, stating that one's agricultural obligations with regard to tithes have been fulfilled properly. And so too, a declaration must be made when first fruits are brought to the temple in Jerusalem. But you don't make any kind of a declaration with regard to teruma. You just give it to the priest. And second tithe and first fruits are forbidden to an acute mourner, but teruma is not. And Rabbi Shimon permits an acute mourner to partake of first fruits, that's an aside, and they both require eradication before Passover in the 4th and 7th years of the sabbatical cycle if one failed to bring them beforehand. If you didn't bring them before the deadline, then you have to burn them. Then it's too late, there's a time limit. And as an aside, Rabbi Shimon exempts first fruits from the obligation of eradication. Right? Like they're bringing in a different teaching as a proof, but now that they mention that teaching, they bring along its digression or its minority opinion along the way, even though that's not really relevant to our conversation. And yet, second tithe and first fruits, Meiser Sheni and Bikurim, differ from teruma in that it is prohibited to burn the former and benefit from the burning, even when the produce is in a state of ritual impurity, even when it's tameh, and therefore unfit to be eaten. For example, one may not burn impure oil for light. And one who eats them when they themselves, the second tithe and the first fruits, are ritually impure, that person is flogged, even though he himself might not be, right? The food can be tameh or the person can be tameh. If he eats impure food, even though he himself is tahor, ritually pure, he's flogged for eating food that was impure. Now, food that was rendered impure cannot be made pure again, so that food would have to be destroyed. Which is not the case with regard to teruma. Teruma, the priest can benefit from it even if it's impure or if he's impure. He can't eat it, but if it was olive oil, he could use it to light a lamp. Right? He can benefit from its light. You can't do that with Meiser Sheni and Bikurim. And all of these differences were not taught in that Baraisa. Therefore, the Gemara has proven that was not an exhaustive list, and it is still possible that there is a difference between teruma and first fruits on the one side and Meiser Sheni on the other that was not included in that Baraisa or in that Mishnah. Therefore, the omission of the law governing an uncircumcised man, right, where we were asking an uncircumcised man may not eat teruma and may not eat bikurim, but perhaps he can eat second tithe, we don't know. The proof was inconclusive. Now, before we get back to that question, having cited this Mishnah, the Gemara proceeds to discuss it, right? We brought in this other law to serve as a proof. Having raised that law, we're going to discuss that law a little more. So having cited the Mishnah, the Gemara discusses it. It was taught in the Baraisa, and we're in 73b now. It was taught in the Baraisa that second tithe and first fruits, Meiser Sheni and Bikurim, are prohibited to an acute mourner, and Rabbi Shimon permits an acute mourner to partake of first fruits, though he agrees that an acute mourner may not partake of Meiser Sheni. And the Gemara asks, from where do the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon derive that first fruits, bikurim, are prohibited to one who is an acute mourner? As it is written, you may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain or of your wine or of your oil, nor the offering of your hand. That's Deuteronomy 12:17. And the master said, quote, the offering, written as teruma, of your hand, in this case, the word teruma refers to bikurim, first fruits. And first fruits are juxtaposed in this verse to second tithe. Just as the second tithe is forbidden to an acute mourner, so too first fruits are prohibited to an acute mourner. And Rabbi Shimon answers that since the merciful one called first fruits teruma in this verse, so the law governing them is similar to that which governs teruma. And just as teruma is permitted to an acute mourner, so too first fruits are permitted to an acute mourner. At this point, I would like to just stop and say this is a very clear illustration of why we need the oral law, right? From just what's written in the Torah, you wouldn't know how to follow these laws. It would be too general and too confusing, and you need the specificity that is either brought down as oral teachings passed from Moses to Joshua, to the elders, and through that whole oral tradition. A few of those laws were given at Mount Sinai in an oral form, and the rest were worked out by our sages over the generations so that you would know, can an acute mourner eat teruma? Can he eat Meiser Sheni? Can he eat Bikurim, I mean, that's not, some of it is spelled out in the Torah and some of it is not. And so you need the law to be worked out by the sages. And that is how the system was designed by God, right? So that it would require people to be studying Torah in every generation so that they would know these long and complex laws. Okay. So the Baraisa continues. And both second tithe and first fruits require eradication before Passover in the 4th and 7th years of the Shemitah cycle. And Rabbi Shimon exempts first fruits from the obligation of eradication. Now the sages who disagree with him, they juxtapose first fruits to second tithe, and just as the second tithe is subject to eradication, so too are first fruits. But the other sage, Rabbi Shimon, does not juxtapose the two laws, and he does not derive one from the other. It was stated above that it is prohibited to burn second tithe and first fruits even when they are in a state of ritual impurity, and that one who eats them, when they themselves, the Meiser Sheni or the Bikurim, the second tithe or the first fruits, when those foods are ritually impure, if a person eats them, he is flogged. Even if he himself, the person's body, is ritually pure. From where do we derive this law? As it was taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Shimon says, the verse, with regard to the confession of tithes, states, I did not consume of it while impure. Now, that's a little unclear in English and Hebrew. I did not consume of it while impure. Does that mean I was not impure when I consumed it, or it was not impure when I consumed it? It says, I did not consume of it while impure. This is a general statement that means whether I, the one who ate it, was ritually impure and the tithe was ritually pure, or whether I was ritually pure and the tithe was ritually impure, either way, the tithe may not be consumed through burning or eating in a state of impurity. And the Tana adds, and where one is actually warned against eating the second tithe in a state of impurity, this I do not know. Although it is obvious from the verse that it is prohibited, the source for the prohibition is unclear, and the Gemara is puzzled by this last statement. The prohibition against eating second tithe when one is in a state of ritual impurity of his body is explicitly written, as it is stated with regard to the ritual impurity imparted by a creeping animal, yet another law, right? That creeping animals, dead creeping things impart teruma, impart impurity. The soul, the person that touches it, shall be impure until the evening, and he shall not eat from the holy things unless he has washed his flesh in water, meaning immersed in the mikvah. And this is referring to second tithe, as will be explained later on page 74b. Now the Gemara explains, rather, this is the dilemma that is being raised here. From where is it derived that one may not eat when the tithe itself is in a state of ritual impurity? And the verse states, in Deuteronomy 12:17, you may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain. And it later states, with regard to offerings that have been disqualified, you shall eat it within your gates, the impure and the pure alike, as the gazelle and as the hart, and the animal, the hart. And a sage of the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, even a ritually impure and a ritually pure person may eat together on one table and out of one bowl without concern. And the merciful one states, that which I said to you there, with regard to disqualified offerings, you shall eat it within your gates. It means regardless of whether it is individual or the meat that is, regardless of whether it is the person or the meat that is impure. But here, with regard to second tithe, you may not eat it in that state, right? So that law was brought in to say there was a distinction made in this other law pertaining to disqualified offerings. That may be eaten by a person who's impure. But second tithe, no, only a person who is tahor, in a state of purity, may eat it. Now, it was stated above that one is prohibited from burning second tithe and first fruits when they are ritually impure, which is not the case with regard to teruma. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that this law does not apply to teruma? You would think that teruma, which is consecrated food, so holy, only priests can eat it. It must be that it can only be consumed in a state if it's pure, whether by eating or by burning. But no, teruma actually has a different law associated with it. How do we know? Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Yochanan said, as the verse with regard to the declaration of tithes states, I did not consume of it while impure. And the words of it teach that of it, the tithe, you may not burn when it is impure, but you may burn and derive benefit from the burning, meaning a candle or an oil lamp. You may derive benefit from the oil of teruma that has become ritually impure. Who may derive benefit from it? A priest, right? So teruma that became, so like olive oil that became tameh, because perhaps a dead sheretz, like a dead creeping thing, fell into it. Okay, now it's impure, it's tameh, so he can't, use it as like a seasoning for his salad. He can't eat it. But he could pour it into his lamp, put the wick in and light it and get light from it. That would be okay. Now, the law is burning teruma that became ritually impure. Teruma is the property of priests, whether it is ritually pure or impure. If it is impure, it must be burned, and the priest may derive benefit from it while it is burning. For example, he may light a lamp with ritually impure teruma oil. Now, this actually makes sense when you think about it. Consecrated food for priests, yes, it's very holy, but you give it to a specific priest, right? You give it to a specific priest, and therefore it becomes his property, and that's why he may benefit from it. Meiser Sheni is not really yours. You've given it to God. God gives it back to you so that you can eat it when you go on a pilgrimage festival and enjoy it in Jerusalem. But if it's impure, then you may not eat it. Right? The Gemara asks, wait a minute. Maybe you should say like this. Of it you may not burn, but you may burn and derive benefit from consecrated oil that became ritually impure. The Gemara refutes this suggestion. The possibility is unacceptable. Is it not a kal v'chomer inference if, with regard to the tithe, which is lenient, the Torah said, may you declare, I did not burn of it while it was impure. Then with regard to consecrated oil, which is more stringent, is it not all the more so prohibited to burn them while ritually impure? I just said that earlier. That's the reason you would think that a priest is not permitted to burn impure oil in his lamp. That's the argument why he shouldn't be able to, but this argument is rejected. The Gemara answers, if so, with regard to teruma as well, say that it is a kal v'chomer inference, meaning from the smaller case to the bigger case, as teruma is certainly more sacred than tithes. If it is prohibited to benefit from the second tithe while it is burning, all the more so would it be prohibited to benefit from teruma while it is burning. And the Gemara answers, isn't it written of it? From there it is derived that there is an item excluded from the prohibition against burning in a state of ritual impurity, and that is the teruma oil of a priest. The Gemara asks, and what did you see that led you to conclude that this exclusionary term of it comes specifically to exclude teruma? Perhaps it comes to exclude consecrated items, people that set something aside to give as a gift to the temple for the upkeep of the temple, for example. Maybe that may not be burned when it is. Maybe that may be burned when it is tameh, and you would do not apply that exclusion to the oil of teruma that belongs to a priest. Well, it is reasonable that I do not exclude consecrated items from the prohibition against benefiting from their burning, as with regard to consecrated items, there are many stringencies, and there's an acronym for these stringencies, Pei, Nun, Kuf, Ayin, Kaf, Samech, right? That's a series of Hebrew letters, which is a mnemonic for the following stringencies that apply to consecrated items, gifts to the temple, which do not apply to teruma, which is the tithe, the first tithe for the priest. And what are these stringencies that apply to consecrated items but don't apply to teruma? Pigul. If during one of the rites involved in the sacrifice of an offering, like its slaughter, or receiving the blood, or bringing it to the altar, or sprinkling it on the altar, if during any of those elements of bringing a sacrifice, the priest or the one bringing the offering entertains the thought of eating the edible portion of the offering at a time that is unfit for eating, meaning beyond the deadline, just that thought, that intention in his head will render the offering invalidated. Nasar, Meat of an offering that remained beyond its allotted time may not be eaten, and it must be burned. This doesn't apply to teruma. The offering is to God. Teruma is given to a priest, not to God. Misuse of consecrated objects, known as me'ilah. One who unwittingly derives personal benefit from items that have been consecrated as a gift to the temple. That person is required to bring a guilt offering for misuse of consecrated objects. Kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court. The punishment of one who eats consecrated items while he is ritually impure is kares. Forbidden to an acute mourner, asur le'oinen. An acute mourner is prohibited from eating consecrated items, but a priest who is an acute mourner may eat teruma. None of these laws apply to teruma. Therefore, consecrated items are more stringent than teruma, and accordingly, they are not excluded from the prohibition against deriving benefit while ritually impure. The Gemara challenges this argument. On the contrary, it is teruma that I would not exclude from the prohibition. I would not exclude it because teruma has its own stringencies, many stringencies. As with regard to teruma, there are many stringencies that apply to it that don't apply to consecrated foods, like, and there's the acronym for remembering it, is a different series of letter, Mem, Ches, Pei, Zayin. And this is a mnemonic for the following. Mem, which stands for Misa, death. One who is prohibited from eating teruma, but he ate it intentionally, is liable to punishment from the hand of heaven. That's kares. 1/5, chomesh, a non-priest to whom teruma is forbidden, who unwittingly ate teruma, is obligated to pay its value to the priest plus 1/5 as a fine. And teruma does not have the possibility of redemption, pidyon. Once it is sanctified, the teruma may not be redeemed and rendered non-sacred, but consecrated items may be redeemed and have their sanctity transferred to money, and then what was redeemed reverts to non-sacred status. And it is forbidden to non-priest, zarim. There are consecrated foods that, when redeemed, could be eaten by a non-priest, but teruma may never be redeemed and may never be eaten by a non-priest. Now, the Gemara answers, now that we've seen that there are stringencies that apply only to consecrated foods but not to teruma, and there are stringencies that apply to teruma but not consecrated foods, so how do we see fit to say that of it in this earlier passage came to exclude teruma from the prohibition against benefiting from it as opposed to consecrated foods? And the Gemara answers, those stringencies that apply to consecrated items are more numerous than the stringencies that apply to teruma. Therefore, it is appropriate to be more stringent with consecrated items and exclude impure teruma from the prohibition against deriving benefit from it while it is burned. You still can't eat it while it is impure, but the priest can burn it as a candle and derive that benefit to receive its light. And if you wish, say instead a different reason, without counting the number of stringencies. Consecrated items are more stringent because one who eats them while ritually impure is liable to receive kares, death at the hands of heaven, and that is more severe. Because one who eats them while ritually impure is liable to receive kares, which is more severe than death at the hand of heaven, the punishment in the case of teruma. Kares is death at the hand of heaven, so I think there was a little misprint there. I'm not sure what's going on. I'm going to go on. It was further stated above that one who eats second tithe and first fruits, when they themselves, the second death and first fruits, are ritually impure, is flogged, which is not the case with regard to teruma. So the Gemara infers from this that it is lashes that he does not receive when he eats teruma that is ritually impure. However, the transgression of a prohibition is involved. Now, from where do we derive that this is prohibited? The verse referring to offerings that have been disqualified. I'm very close to done. If you have questions or comments, get them in. The verse referring to offerings that have been disqualified, which may be eaten by a pure or an impure person. You shall eat it within your gates. Now, the word "it" indicates that it is only this, disqualified offerings, that may be eaten in a state of impurity. but another type of consecrated food, but not another type of consecrated food. This is a prohibition that is derived by inference from a positive mitzvah, i.e., it is not stated in the Torah in the form of a prohibition. It's just since you must do that, therefore you can't do that, but it doesn't say you cannot do that. So sometimes we have what is known as a negative commandment stated as an inference from a positive commandment, not explicitly stated as a negative commandment. When you have that, you don't kick in the punishment for violating a negative commandment, which is usually more stringent than violating a positive commandment. When you violate a positive commandment, usually the fix for that is go ahead and do what you neglected to do. When you violate a negative commandment, you already did that which was prohibited to you, and that's when we bring in a sin offering and other kinds of punishments. And there's a principle that a prohibition that stems from a positive mitzvah is classified as a positive mitzvah for which no lashes are administered. That's all I have for today. Before I go to questions and comments, let me mention today's Thursday. We have class tomorrow, Friday, at the regular Friday time, noon. Then the Shabbos, but Saturday night, I'm out of here. So I'll be getting ready, and then I leave very early Sunday morning, and I'm gone for a week. So we'll have class tomorrow, and then we'll be on our own until Monday, May 30th. And at that time, I'll come back, and as I do when I've been away for a few days, I'll do a highlights show from that week when I was away, and then we'll get back on schedule. That day. I mean, I'll do 9 pages worth of highlights that day, and then we'll back regular programming the following Tuesday. We just do 1 page. All right? Regular class tomorrow, then we're off until Monday, May 30th. Right. Questions. Here on Yevamos, page 73. Elvis, what constitutes an acute mourner according to halacha? Is this just the time between the death and burial, or does it extend throughout Shiva or Shloshim? No, the acute mourner is one who just lost his relative that day and the corpse has not yet been buried. That's when you are an acute mourner. Yosef, some who doubt oral tradition don't understand that interpretation should also be divinely guided, lest everyone do according to their own whims. Exactly. The oral law doesn't mean that, things are confusing, everybody figures it out for himself. No, you look to your elders in that generation. And the oral law doesn't change from generation to generation. It only changes when there's a new question that comes up that just didn't exist before. And it's not so much that the oral law changes, it's that it gets extended to apply to this novel situation. And that's why the oral tradition was given, so that the Torah would remain eternally relevant and always capable of being applied, because there would be the elders in every generation who can answer the questions when new questions come up. When medicine advanced to the point that there were technologies that could keep a person alive even when their brain was dead, or that could perform a kind of surgery that wasn't possible before. That question had simply never been asked before, but the principles were already there. So the oral law does not mutate quickly at all. It's grown tremendously, but it's hundreds of thousands of sages over thousands of years who have grown it, and given how many people have toiled in understanding the law, the Talmud is actually not that big. It's vast, right? But it could have been much more vast. It's like there is a stability to Jewish law. It may be difficult to understand. It may require a lot of attention just so we understand what the law is. But the law, has moved at the correct pace over these millennia. Sharon, that is so true. Answering Yosef, moral relativism is a real risk here. Exactly. And that's why, in every generation, you look to the Gedolim, the great Torah scholars who, have that whole tradition at their disposal. so that they can answer these questions from a Torah perspective. All right, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. I look forward to learning with you then. Good night.